Welcome to the podcast. Today we have founder Don Milne with us again. We're telling stories that Don had researched a couple of years ago while he was doing his World War II 100 Fallen blog. Thank you for joining us today, Don. And you want to tell us a story?
Yeah, the story I picked to share today is an individual by the name of John Mooney Kirby. He was a Marine. He was actually born in Georgia on January 29th, 1918. His parents, John and Francis, they were both born in Georgia too. His father was a shipyard driller, and later he was a chief engineer with the YMCA. So I remember looking that up. I'm thinking, what kind of engineers would work for the YMCA? But that was in the 1920s, and maybe there was something engineering that you would do with the YMCA back then. His mother died in 1933 when he would have been 15 years old. He did have three older brothers and an older sister. One of his brothers also served during the war. He was in the Army. By the 1940 census, John had already completed 2 years of high school, and by that point, he was already in the Marines. He was a private first class. And eventually, John rose to the rank of sergeant, and his unit was Company C, 5th Tank Battalion, 5th Marine Division. During the war, on December 17th of 1943, while he was on home at leave at some point, he married Anna Lee Walker. So when I was writing these stories as part of my blog, I would do this on my lunch break. So I only had like an hour of time. There may be more information about Sergeant Kirby. And so when someone eventually gets this name and says they want to do a more complete story, they may be able to fill in the gaps, and that would be great to have more details. But I'm kind of picking up the story in his last position of service, which was in the Battle of Iwo Jima. So he was in command of a flamethrower tank when the 5th Marine Division landed on Iwo Jima on February 19th of 1945. So it looks like a regular Sherman tank, but apart from the normal gun on the front, it had a separate gun that shot out flames, and they would use that to attack pillboxes because the pillboxes might not take a hit from a gun as effectively as a flamethrower would go in and take out all the oxygen and obviously kill everybody that was touched by the flames. So, and because it was inside a tank, it would make it easier for them to get a little bit closer, and only the bigger Japanese weapons could knock them out. We also had Marines carrying the flamethrowers on their backs, and that was super dangerous. And for obvious reasons, you don't have a lot of armor when you're just carrying that around on your own. So he was in charge of one of these tanks, and he only lived until 3 days later is when he was killed. And for what he did while serving in the Battle of Iwo Jima, he was awarded posthumously the Silver Star. And I was able to find the citation that went along with that. And this is what it said: "Cool and courageous while approaching to destroy an enemy installation, Sergeant Kirby acted instantly when his tank threw a track, and dismounting from the disabled vehicle, directed his crew in a hurried attempt to effect repairs despite the sudden concentration of blasting fire pouring forth from a Japanese emplacement beyond range of the tank's flame gun. Determined to reduce the heavy volume of hostile fire, he advanced towards the enemy position by foot, carrying a submachine gun, and succeeded in delivering several bursts of fire into the entrance and ports of the installation before he fell under the impact of an enemy grenade. By his unfaltering leadership, tenacious perseverance, and self-sacrificing devoted duty, he aided in reducing the hostile fire and enabled the other members of the tank crew to place their vehicle back in action. His conduct throughout reflects the highest credit upon Sergeant Kirby and the United States Naval Services. He gallantly gave his life for his country." So Sergeant Kirby is now buried at the Rest Haven Memorial Park Cemetery in Princeton, West Virginia. So even though his family, at least when he was growing up, lived in Georgia, and his parents were born in Georgia, for some reason he's now buried in Princeton, West Virginia. I don't know what happened to his widow. So what happened after he died, something that right now is not part of the story.
This is Tatiana. I'm interrupting the podcast to ask you to do me a favor. Please subscribe. I know you hear that a million times on YouTube and all over everything, but it really does help us grow. As we get more listeners, we're able to reach your audience and tell these stories to more people, which I think honestly is the main goal that we're trying to accomplish here, is get these stories told to the next generation so that we honor and, remember these fallen. And thank you so much for listening, and go back to continuing listening to the podcast.
I did want to share one other thing. When I was writing this blog, I would sometimes find out, hey, there was somebody born on the exact same day as this person who went on and did something that we may know him for some other thing that made him famous. So there was this individual by the name of John Forsythe. He was born on the exact same day as Sergeant Kirby. And probably in 2021, people aren't going to know too much about who's John Forsythe. But if you were watching TV back in the 1970s and the 1980s, there were a couple of TV shows. One was called Charlie's Angels, and the other was called Dynasty. And he was an actor on both of those TV shows. He actually had some bit movie parts back in the 1940s, and he served the country during World War II. In his case, he didn't make it overseas. He served stateside making films for the Army, but he also served in helping injured soldiers who were trying to recover their speech. So he helped with that. So two guys born on the exact same day, John Kirby, John Forsythe. John Kirby earned the Silver Star posthumously, died at the Battle of Iwo Jima. John Forsythe becomes a pretty well-known actor, and he died in 2010. So that's what I wanted to share our podcast today. Another one of the many stories that our writers will find about the very difficult fighting of the Marines that we had on Iwo Jima. I saw one other thing that I noted. This John Forsythe, he was actually in a movie that was made during World War II called Destination Tokyo. So if you're an old war movie buff, you may have seen that. It was a movie with Cary Grant on a submarine. So I was thinking the movie was made in 1943, and they tried very much wherever they could to get these films to our troops. And if he was on an aircraft carrier, I'm sure they had movie night every night, and I'm sure they brought these films in as quickly as they could. It's very likely that if he was on a ship traveling to Iwo Jima, he could have seen this movie, or maybe it was when he was in Hawaii staging. He could have seen this movie with John Forsythe, a guy born on the exact same day he was, acting in a movie. Of course, he wouldn't know that they had shared the same birthday, but they would have had that possible connection.
Not everyone that listens to this podcast is necessarily going to be a researcher, but these stories have impact because I think they teach us how part of moving on, or part of living, is moving on and honoring those who are gone. Seeing those two different stories can be really sad if we just forget that one man's, we forget his life. It's really important that the loss isn't just, a loss. It's a memory that can teach us and help us and make us better.
In a case like this, where he was a Silver Star recipient, and it's obviously clear that the actions he took probably led to the lives of men in his unit being saved that day and eventually coming home. Part of what we'll be able to do with this project is we will be able to have people identify which company they were in. So Sergeant Kirby was in Company C, 5th Tank Battalion. So eventually, you'll be able to, through our partnership with Together We Served, if you say had a great grandfather that was in Company C, 5th Tank Battalion, you could look that information up and you would see, hey, my grandfather was in the same company as John Kirby. There's a very good chance that I'm here today because of John Kirby. So there's a connection with probably millions of Americans today to these people that didn't make it home, especially in the case of those who received commendations for valor, that they made a sacrifice, and by happenstance, it's resulted in people being here that never would have been here.
That's so cool. I didn't realize that was a feature on Together We Serve, that eventually, I mean, this is obviously once we've filled this in, because right now it's not really any information there, but like the average person could find their ancestor and by unit.
Yep. If you knew what unit the person was, we'll be able to match up every single other person that was in that same unit.
That's really going to be a huge benefit in moving forward. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for taking your time today and sharing with us this story of Sergeant Kirby. And thank you for listening to the podcast. And we'll see you next week.